I borrowed a library book my mom had checked out as a child. Minus inside was a 50-year-old unsent love letter that explained why she never spoke about her past. My mother never discussed her childhood. When our small-town library was clearing out books that hadn't circulated in decades, I spotted one with her maiden name on the checkout card from 1972. Inside was a yellowed letter she'd written to a boy who died before she could deliver it. That forgotten note explained the sadness she'd carried my entire life and finally opened the door to conversations we'd never been able to have. Our town library was closing after 87 years apart, another victim of budget cuts and digital reading habits. During the final clearance sale, I browsed through ancient hardcovers nobody had checked out in decades. These are getting pulped next week if nobody takes them, the librarian explained, gesturing to cardboard boxes filled with forgotten stories. I flipped idly through a dusty collection of poetry from 1970, largely because its faded blue spine matched my living room decor. When I opened the back cover, the yellowed checkout card stopped my browsing cold. There in careful teenage handwriting was my mother's maiden name, Margaret Ann Collins Pert, May 16, 1972. Moan never talked about her childhood. I knew she'd grown up in the same small town, but whenever the topic arose, she'd redirect the conversation with practiced skill. Dad once whispered that something bad happened when she was young, but respected her silence too much to elaborate. I bought the book for 50 cents, curious what teenage Margaret had been reading. The collection seemed unremarkable, parent romantic poetry popular in the early 70s, but when I reached page 73, a folded paper slipped out, yellowed with age and creased from decades pressed between pages. Dear Jason, it began in the same careful script from the checkout card. I've written this letter 7 times now. The words never come out right. How do you tell someone they've changed your entire life in just 3 months? How do you explain that you finally understand what those poems mean? Prayer, the ones about hearts beating in sync and feeling complete when someone's eyes meet yours? I should have stopped reading. This was clearly private, not meant for my eyes, but the next lines kept me going. Everyone says 16 is too young to know what love is, but I think when you know, you just know, and I know that I love you, Jason Porter. I am leaving this in your locker after graduation tomorrow. Please call me when you get home. My dad is finally letting me use the phone this summer. The letter was signed simply Margaret, Maggie, with a small heart drawn beside it. It was dated the 8th of June, 1972. The name Jason Porter sounded vaguely familiar, current perhaps from Old Town memorial plaques or conversations overheard at family gatherings. That evening, I called my Uncle Robert, Mom's older brother, Jason Porter, he repeated, his voice suddenly heavy. Where did you hear that name? I explained about the book and letter. The line went quiet for so long I thought we'd been disconnected. Jason died the night before graduation, Uncle Robert finally said. Your mom was devastated. She'd been tutoring him in English that spring. They'd gotten close. After the funeral, she boxed up everything from that year, never talked about him again. When I visited Mom that Sunday, I brought the book but not the letter. Over coffee, I casually mentioned finding a book she'd checked out decades ago. Her hands trembled slightly as she took it. I remember this, she whispered, running her fingers along the spine. I was studying poetry with, she paused, with a friend. Jason Porter? I asked gently, her eyes snapped up, a mixture of shock, and something else, perhaps relief, washing over her face. I explained about the letter, apologizing for reading something so personal. To my surprise, she asked to see it. As she read her own decades-old words, tears slipped down her cheeks. I never gave it to him, she said softly. I was going to put it in his locker after the ceremony. He never knew how I felt. That afternoon, for the first time in my life, Mom told me about her childhood, about Jason, her first love, about plans made and futures imagined, about grief at 16 that felt too heavy to carry. I thought if I never spoke about it, it would eventually fade, she explained. Instead, I just carried it silently. A forgotten library book revealed not just a lost love letter, but the key to understanding the quiet sadness my mother had carried my entire life. Sometimes the stories that shape us most are the ones we never tell.